So today we're going to talk about adaptation, resilience, and insurability, especially whether it's financeable and what it does to investment portfolios. So we're going to focus first on the risks it creates for investments, potential solution to participate into investing into adaptation and resilience solutions, and lastly, define whether we can consider adaptation and resilience as an emerging asset class, and whether some form of standards or regulatory frameworks or policies would be further desirable to make it so. So to join me into this conversation, we have Brigitte, Layali, and Jennifer. And before we kick off, I'd like to ask each one of you if you could, in less than 1 minute, tell us very briefly what your organization does, but most importantly, from which angle within your organization you're going to speak today. So maybe, Brigitte, let's start with you.
Merci, Hervé. So my name is Brigitte Roy. I act as Chief Counsel for Global Risk Management at WSP. WSP is a publicly traded company headquartered right here in Montreal. We have some 83,000 professional engineers that are busily delivering approximately 200,000 projects every year in more than 50 countries around the world. In my role, I oversee the enterprise risk management as well as the procurement of insurance, and last but not least, the management of some claims and litigation for the company. So I'm excited to be here today, and I guess I'll be wearing two hats or offer two perspectives. The first one is the perspective of an engineering firm very much involved in delivering these exciting projects for special assets and infrastructures. And the second perspective will be that of the insurance market.
And I'm Layali Ramahi. I'm the regional lead for North America with UNEP Finance Initiative. UNEP FI brings together a global network of banks, insurance, and investors to catalyze action to deliver on sustainable economies. Our role is mainly, as I always say it, the translator. We translate the science, the policy, the market direction into what financial institutions need to do. So today in particular, I'll be speaking about that holistic, sustainable financial system, but mainly through the lens of the work that we're doing with the Principles for Sustainable Insurance and with the Adaptation and Resilience Investor Collaborative. Mainly, where the idea is to reflect how we can look at those early signs of adaptation and resilience as market signals for recovery and long-term transition.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Coulson, Global Head of ESG at BCI, which is a dedicated asset manager, largely for the public sector pension plans in our province, but we do have 32 different clients that we manage money for. And so with my team, we're basically embedded across the different asset classes at BCI. So our job as a team is to work directly with those investment teams and make sure that all of the risks and opportunities are being thought of and considered as we make those investment decisions. So certainly, physical risk and adaptation has come more and more into those conversations as we look to allocate capital. So that is the perspective that I will bring today.
Thank you. So we're going to spend this first set of 10 minutes to focus a little bit on risk. We all know that climate mitigation efforts have been too slow, yet the clock doesn't stop ticking. And this has started to introduce some climate-related induced risks into investments and portfolios. So, Jennifer, let's start with you as an investor, as an asset manager. Can you describe how, first of all, what is your investing time horizon and how physical risk especially has started to be integrated within asset or portfolio analysis?
Sure. So first of all, the investment time horizon is an important one when you're talking about climate risk and opportunity. Like I said, we manage money mostly for pension funds that have a very long-term perspective, but then we also manage money for insurance clients where they're managing a very different kind of set of liabilities. But internally, all of our mandates would have a different time horizon associated with them. I would say if you're thinking about real estate, infrastructure, kind of the real assets component of what we do, you're looking multi-decade, right? So we really have to be thinking about what is the world going to look like 20, 30 years from now, and who is going to underwrite this asset next, right? After we're finished with our investment cycle. But then, of course, we invest in the public markets as well. So internal active mandates. I mean, you're talking about a shorter time frame there. It's a very liquid space. So there's a real range within fixed income. You can probably give it a good 5 to 7 years, but also just depending on the duration of the instrument that we're looking at. So there is a range internally, even though we love to say we are long-term investors, generally speaking, because of who we're managing money for. But because of that, when we are looking at new investments, so first on the diligence side, we of course want to make sure that we're aware geographically, where is that asset located, what kind of hazards are present there, how vulnerable is that asset to the hazards. And ultimately what we're trying to do is take all of that very, what I would call kind of scientific information that we know of about that region, and we're trying to translate that for the investment teams into some kind of financial impact. So I wouldn't say we have this nut cracked by any means. I think all of us are on a bit of a learning journey here. But the data is getting better, and we can start to really add insight into that investment process. Of course, if we're doing screening very early on and we have to do deeper due diligence, there's definitely a larger stream of work that is going to be happening there. We might bring in specialized advisors where we need extra expertise to learn more about this particular asset. And so that kind of sums up maybe what we're doing on the diligence side of things at a very high level. But then, of course, we have the asset management component of the investment portfolio. So once we actually own the asset, tracking these things over time, working with management to assess their maturity on the topic, what kind of internal expertise do they have, how can we be complementary in terms of what our team can bring to the conversation, and making sure that everybody is thinking along the same lines when it comes to resilience. So I'd kind of break it down that way in terms of due diligence, but then the asset management component as well. 3
very quick follow-up deep dive questions. First of all, where are you getting this data from?
Oh yeah, where do we get the data? So, I mean, to a great degree, there's a lot of publicly available data out there when it comes to this kind of information in terms of hazards, vulnerabilities, and things like that. Of course, the challenge is there's just a huge volume of it, and we have to make it decision useful. So we do have specialized data providers. We actually just went through a process evaluating many of them because there has been a lot of new entrants in the space. So we will be bringing on a new data platform for that reason. But then when I think about what we do on more of the real asset space, I mean, we do have the benefit of direct access to management. Not that we wouldn't have that in the public space, but it's very different, right? And you're going through a much deeper diligence process on the private side. So we do have the ability to, work with partner GPs as well as get information directly from management. So it's not the shortage of data. I would say it's translating the data into an investment decision useful.
And this integration of physical risk, has it been, how recent has this process been? Has it been a progressive integration? Or would you say there's been 1 or 2 events that have been like a aha moment and where you could date a shift in analysis?
I think it's a combination of both. Definitely the PG&E example in the fixed income space, I think, was a big one for all of us. You could argue that it was well known, but I think for people who are not following it on a day-to-day basis, it was a big surprise. So you have really large examples like that, but then at the same time, just by the nature of some of the assets that we invest in, you start to see what's happening over time, like beyond just the acute events, but chronically, what are some of the hazards that are going to impact this asset over time? So it's the tangible nature of it that I feel has really gotten the investment team's attention, that has just slowly built over time, complemented with some large events.
Last quick question. So we spoke about risk. Physical risk to the assets and the investment. There is also the risk of insurance pulling out. In some ways, you can be invested for 30 plus years, but it may take just 12 months for insurability to change availability. Is that something that you're concerned at this stage, or you think it's certainly something coming at some point, but not yet of a concern?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'd put it in the category of a concern, but it's definitely part of our diligence in terms of what types of insurance this asset is covered by, at what price, and then combined with like all of our analysis in terms of the hazards and the vulnerabilities, is there a risk that price continues to grow over the next 20 years, or is there a risk that it is uninsurable at some point? Those are absolutely questions that are being asked. But I haven't seen enough transactions at this point where it's been a total deal breaker to say that it would be like a major concern, but has to be part of the analysis.
So it's a perfect segue to turn towards you, Brigitte. But before we speak about the concept of project insurance, from your experience, your firm's experience, could you give us a couple of examples of project risk?
Obviously, as a provider and being very much part of the delivery of complex projects across the globe, engineering, professional services are very much at risk. I would say that for any engineering firm out there, the principal risk is that of an error and omission in the context of delivering services. So as I listen to your investment strategy and how we approach delivering such complex projects, obviously, the presence of an insurer is very important. Insurers, I often say, they invest in us, they invest in our risk, and they invest in our company. So at WSP, for example, as a firm, we do invest significant resources in developing a very strong working relationship with our insurers. We build what we call our master program every year to cover our risks in execution of projects, whether it's an error and omission, general liability, a pollution incident that could occur, all the way to personal and damages and injuries, all the way to cyber incidents that may also occur in the delivery of a project. But in addition to, and I think this is the segue into project insurance, inasmuch it's important for our company to have a strong working relationship with insurers, when you're involved in a more traditional large infrastructure project where there's several players involved, various stakeholders, from the constructor to the engineer, the architect, and a variety of other consultants, project insurance is quite beneficial. In a way, you're getting an insurance partner to come on board with the project and extend the coverage to the various participants that are involved in the delivery. Unfortunately, as we were speaking a little bit earlier, the project insurance industry in North America has been a bit challenging over the past 5 years. And I think that's because we were involving the insurers a little bit late in the game. They were getting very limited access to information at the underwriting level. We would just sort of present the project once it was all neatly tied together, ready to kick off, and requesting insurance. So as a result, we were getting high premiums for project insurance. And within a matter of, I would say, weeks after starting the delivery, you'd start having claims popping up. So we felt that we perhaps in our industry, we were being somewhat abusive towards project insurers. And as you can expect, they suffered massive losses over the past 5 years, and some started to walk away from the industry as a whole. Where we are today, I think that the appetite is definitely coming back. And that's what we need to start doing, is involving the insurer as an investor very early on in the project planning phase. Whether it's project planning, development, site selection, if you're going to be asking the insurer to be part of the process from the planning all the way through the execution, and sometimes a 10, 15-year life cycle during the execution of the project, it's very important to have the underwriters take part of the planning process along with the consultants early on. I think they can provide a much better understanding of the project. They can provide a better premium. And last but not least, I'll say that insurers also have incredible access to data and analytics, which can make them a valuable partner during the project planning phase. They have lots of information, not just climate related, but around the site selection, the insurability of some of the sites, some of the partners involved into the project. So it's a very good working relationship, but we need to bring them to the table much sooner than we traditionally did.
And in project management, is insurance perceived as a contingency fund, you would say?
You know what? It shouldn't. It traditionally was, which was a bit the problem that we were having in the past. A lot of people viewed the project-specific policy as the contingency fund. I think project insurers, just like all of our insurers at WSP, should be viewed as investors in our risk, business partners, so that they can stay with us throughout the duration of the project and not, to your point, withdraw at the last minute without any signs of warnings.
Layali, could you illustrate for us some protection gaps that you see?
Yeah, I think it's great that we jump on the value of the different perspectives from an investor to an insurance in project specifically. But zooming a bit out, how does this all continue to flow sustainably within the economy, within all the parts, to even get more projects to be more adaptable, more approachable, more investors to find them more normalized? And I think the way we look, or the simple definition of a protection gap, it's that gap between the economic losses and what is actually insured. So what are these both different expectations? And if we look at the average numbers, according to Swiss Re, Munich Re will say about last year, it was between 200 to 250 billion loss. Half of it only was insured and the other half was not insured. And this is the gap that we're talking about. Yes, insurability and the coverage has been rising, which is good, as you're saying, the engagement and the ecosystem, whether project or the availability across different markets has increased from 25 to almost 40, 50% of coverage. But in absolute terms, the losses are exceeding the coverage because of the value that is associated with expended risk. So it's importantly to look at what do we mean by the protection gap from a broader societal resilience and ecosystem coverage and moving forward. So it's important to look at not just only the coverage or its availability, but as a signal for it in terms of the limitation for absorption of risk. Eventually, the insurance is about not just managing the risk, but transferring the risk. So when you start to see that insurance gap expanding because we're not investing in the resilience of what we're building, whether projects or what is already built and available, but requires that new upgrade because of the changing environment, this is where we start to see the protection gap expanding. And when we look at the protection gap, it's not only just the financial system or, as we say, profitability of an insurance company. Eventually, a protection gap means this loss needs to be absorbed. It's absorbed by households, it's absorbed by corporates, it's absorbed eventually fiscally by governments. And that means that these losses are slowing the recovery. So the entire economic cycle will slow down. So how do we approach the protection gap as starting to say this is the resilience gap? How much do we need to build to actually make the system more absorbable of risk and recovers faster with the returns from the insurance coverage?
Okay, so now let's switch gear a little bit. We understand better this protection gap. How do we build resilient assets? And Jennifer, starting with you, how do you build a resilient portfolio?
Not easily, I would say. I mean, it sounds like a really simple question. But when you have a large diversified portfolio across asset classes, it becomes much more challenging. But we do have a number of tools, I would say, at our disposal. I mean, some of which I've already talked about in terms of, engaging with the management teams. If we're talking about, our infrastructure assets, we pretty much always have a board seat on those companies. So we can have the direct information from management. If there is a concern that we have flagged internally, there's a very natural mechanism there to raise it at the board level as a strategic issue. So we've been spending more time, I would say, just within the past year, maybe year and a half, really prioritizing what are some of the key assets where we really need to understand the maturity of the management team on this. So that's a big one. Sometimes you need to actually infuse capital into those investments. You take utilities, for example, that are in need of a variety of upgrades to deal with extreme weather. So that doesn't always happen, but it certainly is coming up more and more with aging infrastructure. Of course, within the utility space, you have to balance that with affordability as well, because many of the regulators can't see how they can pass that on to customers at this particular point in time. So sometimes there is a need for capital. And then I'll give an example too, where we have actually had to dispose of assets on the real estate subsidiary side of things. So our real estate subsidiary's name is Quadreal, which is a relatively common name now in the real estate space. And I want to say it's going back about 5 years now, where they did a full analysis of their portfolio and looked for those hot spots where they didn't feel like it was priced in yet, but they knew there was going to be issues down the road. And so it was extreme enough for them to say, these assets we need to unload at this point, because at some point it will get priced in, and we don't want to be the one holding that. It doesn't necessarily solve the bigger, societal problem, but in terms of protecting our investment, that's something that was felt needed to be done. So a variety of different tools depending on many different factors.
Okay. Layali, from your observation of the financial sector, from where you sit in, how has this thinking been changing around resilience?
Well, I'm going to still focus on the lens where I think, following up on your point, where sometimes the risk reached a level where you have to walk away. And unfortunately, probably everybody reads the media. We do not want to reach to a point where insurance are leaving entire markets. So as the risks start to increase, I think the most powerful part that we can look at insurance, that it can be a signal or an important tool for adaptation and resilience itself. Usually it was looked at the coverage, you're covered, you recover faster. That's the normal way of insurance, backwards looking and then moving forward. But I think now the market is starting to look at the insurance in particular as a signal. As an incentivizing behavior. As soon as you change the price, as soon as you send the signal that you're going to withdraw, you're directly saying markets need to behave in a different manner. So how can we look at the evolving transformation? Is that historically insurers were looking at the risk itself, at the hazard itself. But now they're starting to move more into what was described before as looking at the asset value itself and its resilience, and looking at the system more broadly. So as being engaged in a project, but rather looking at the asset's resilience itself, not just only as the hazard, but how is this facility more resilient to floods, or more resilient to fire, or how is the business continuity of this organization to shift supply chains based on different hazards, and then that will be taken into account. So similar properties next to each other can have different underwriting prices, not just only as the hazard itself, but based on the resilience specifications of that asset or property itself. So adapting that broader concept is gradually changing within the underwriter's perspective, to avoid reaching the point where the risk is too high and you have to withdraw from the market. So rather utilizing conversations and dialogue as a signal to incentivize different behavior, different resilience.
And can you elaborate a bit more on precisely what type of incentives can there be it parametric insurance, being it incentives from municipalities or governments? What those incentives can be?
There are, as you mentioned, in terms of incentives, there are. The growing one is lowering the underwriting price, which is, I think this is let's just say the evolving one, the newer one with the corporates. If you're looking at developed market, how can you negotiate lower premiums because of investing now that we are going to do, which is where the investors find extra opportunity in resilience to lower that underwriting risk. There are the more mature, for instance, approaches which work for a different market, like the parametric insurance, specifically that were designed, or the index-based insurance that were specifically designed to address a gap in the market, which was the markets usually as insurance, it's indemnity-based. So after the hazard happens, I come to assess the damage, and by the time you release the funds, it's very late. So how can we adjust and build that resilience in terms of looking at index insurance or parametric insurance that automatically pay out based on a pre-identified trigger? So that's another adaptation resilience approach. There's also other evolving facilities like pooling risk facilities at the sovereign level, which is pooled facilities. We're seeing it more in the Caribbean. We're seeing it more in hurricane defense. The African also credit facility. So how do you pool different risks to directly pay out for drought, for instance? And the final one, which is a more developed market, which is catastrophe bonds. How can you underwrite all the specific risks, and investors wanting to take uncorrelated assets and exposure that will directly give both the investor a benefit and also the risk taker and the risk transfer mechanism of the insurance industry.
Great. Brigitte, I have a couple of questions for you. First, you discussed earlier that you're taking a much more proactive management of project risk. In fact, if you can, you could explain to us the two types of risk that you're facing. And I'm thinking in terms of services you offer, but also reps and warranties. If you could explain to the audience a little bit better the type of risk you're facing these days.
Well, obviously, without divulging too many secrets about WSP, but like every other engineering firm, we are visionaries. We want to change the face of the world and redefine cities in which we work. But doing so comes at a bit of a cost. And I would say that our principal risk in delivering projects always remains the risk of an error, an omission in the design services. We're seeing also quite a few risks pop up in what I call the integration phase of a project, where you're trying to integrate together some of the design elements of a project with the systems that are in place. And integrating this is a bit of a puzzle to put together, and quite frankly, does lead to a higher volume of claims and litigation than we love to see. Now, the irony of this is that some of these issues can occur during the project delivery, in which case we'll face project delays, we'll have to do some redesign and face some damages from the various parties that are involved. But a lot of these claims and litigation can also manifest years after the asset has been in operation. And I think that's, again, why we need the support of insurers along that journey. You know, we spoke quite a bit about where does the climate risk stand in all of this. And I'm not going to say that it's an emerging risk. It is. I think we have to look at it from the perspective of WSP is as we're trying to really build more resilient communities and climate-friendly projects. We may be designing something up to code today, but what we don't know is what the future holds and how climate patterns will change and affect some of the projects that we have put together.
So I'm going to stay with you, but we're going to move in the last part of our discussion after discussing risk, discussing how you build more resilient assets. I want to discuss adaptation and resilience, both more for you as a business model, I would say, and for other two panelists as a potential asset class. I was quite fascinated when we discussed a month ago together that beyond project risk management to make project more resilient, how WSP actually also strengthened its business model itself to become a more resilient organization. If you could describe that.
So this is the time where you want me to switch my hat from insurer to WSP. We spoke about the fact that the WSP 10 years ago is very different from the WSP that we have today, where our company has really shifted from a more traditional design services firm in transport infrastructure and property buildings to where we are today, which is a much more diversified platform. Transport and infrastructure today is 37% of our business. Earth and environment, 29%. Property buildings is at 22%. And last but certainly not the least, power and energy, which is at 12%. Now, what does this mean? Our services are able to vary and include much more than just your traditional design services, which I've said has sometimes led us to a larger volume of claims and disputes. We've now been able to extend our offerings to consultancy, advisory, planning, project management, asset management as well. And really, this diversified platform has allowed us to better manage our overall risk profile at WSP. And it's definitely something that insurers, our partners, have noticed. And it's made us what I do think is a much more attractive insured to the market as we've been able to improve and somewhat dilute our overall risk profile.
So moving to now the investment portfolio beyond the business model. Jennifer, would you like to see adaptation investment opportunities? And if so, what type?
Yes, it would be the very brief answer to that. Because I do think there's a lot of opportunity in this space. I mean, even if you look at the labeled bond space at this point, there's many bond frameworks sustainable bond frameworks that would include adaptation, to some degree within their frameworks. I still think we're not necessarily seeing that translate into higher allocations toward adaptation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity within that fixed income space, definitely. Just checking, before this event, I mean, it's in the Canadian government, Ontario, and Quebec sustainable bond framework. So it's clearly on the radar of the sovereigns. And we are very active in that space, I would say, both in the sovereign and the corporate sustainable bond space. I think once you go into the corporates, you tend to see more of like the real estate firms, the publicly listed REITs, for obvious reasons, I think, really including adaptation. But then, of course, we have the benefit of being able to go across the capital stack. We can be a little bit more innovative. We actually did a private placement with WSP. I think it was almost 2 years ago now. So investing in the EPC players they're going to have to, be a really big partner in this space. We also own an insurance company, as an example, within our private equity portfolio. So we've been talking to them about what their product shelf looks like, how they could actually be offering, products in this space that, it's helpful for all the reasons that we've laid out, but it also helps, our investment in this company and increases revenue. So it's a win-win. So there's lots of opportunity, I think.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting indeed that you bring up a very good point that beyond pure adaptation investment opportunities, there are also proxies, and the example of power utilities that have requirement to build resilience could, and you mentioned also insurance, but can be viewed as a way to invest into adaptation.
Absolutely.
Layali, last two questions of this panel. The first one, focusing on your constituents, so at the micro level, at the company level, and the second one more, we're going to think system level. But first, at the financial institution level, do you see investment appetite for adaptation and resilience? And from your vantage point, do you consider that there are enough products?
I think that it's good that you say, starting with the appetite. Yes, 100%. There is the appetite. And especially as we talked about the innovations, I would start from not just investor appetite, but also the underwriting appetite. I think despite the innovations that we're seeing in terms of changing risk, I think the market is very good at the risk transfer, but it was not designed for proactively reducing risk. And adaptation is all designed about now changing to reduce the risk before it actually happens. So how can you invest in adaptation so that the insurance comes on board and you're actually making sure that the asset is resilient, reducing the associated costs with the hazards, which are now more uncertain with climate change. So how can we build that entire ecosystem? So which is good for the insurance and also good for the investor. And also from a broader system lens, I would be missed to not say that we described everything on the gray, but imagine when you start to include the green. So how can you look at green infrastructure or nature-based solutions that can actually be an ally in absorbing risk? How can they build resilience and be integrated into further structures? And those are different metrics that need to be still integrated into the modeling, into the actuarial models. How can I say that restoring this floodplain would actually lower my underwriting risks on certain properties? The questions are there, but we're still getting the right calibration of how much can we value the risk. So not just the gray, but also the green, and looking at it from a system perspective. But if we're looking at broader opportunities or barriers that we're still seeing, I think the first one is, again, we go back to taxonomy. Resilience means different things for different people. what do we define as resilient on the asset side or on the system side? And the other one, if the second one, if we look at the measurement, where is the value? Is the value for me as an underwriting insurance, or is it for the investor that's investing, or is it for the asset class itself or societal? So realizing how to measure it, and also where the benefits go, depends on who is paying and how the risk will be priced, and of course the reward will be. So defining those are still the barriers in terms of expanding resilience, and also making sure that the underwriting is giving the right signal to incentivize resilience.
So you're starting to touch upon system-wide thinking. And as a UN-led organization focused especially on finance, how do you think globally can insurers, investors, public actors better align capital to reduce losses, protect assets, and build resilience? Is it standards and frameworks, as you mentioned taxonomies a minute ago? What can be done to move the system as a whole? And beyond frameworks, where can you be a force to stimulate product innovation?
Well, absolutely. The standards would be appropriate in terms of definitions of what do we mean by resilience. There needs to be more education, not from a standard just perspective or disclosure perspective, but rather alignment on a certain page. But also when you talk about resilience, there is resilience at a system level, at a location level, and at an asset level. So we need to all be on the same page. So that will not happen without dialogue. Definitely there are policy incentives. And sometimes I always describe the example on housing, which is we do have an affordability crisis. There are incentives from policymakers on reducing costs to invest in certain resilience. The households do not know. The insurance need to incentivize it. But at the same time, when you go to your mortgage, to the financial system that's underwriting your mortgage, they do not know about the policy specifications or what needs to be there. So that can only happen with engaging in dialogue all the participants, the beneficiaries, the policy makers, and that's as simple as a household mortgage insurance. So imagine if you're talking at a sovereign level. Imagine when you bring it down to an ecosystem level or a project level. As Bridget mentioned before, there has to be dialogue among all the participants to go beyond the standards. It's how is it implemented on the ground.
So as we're nearing the end of our panel, I'd like to give the opportunity to my panelists if you want to have a closing word. Otherwise, I will have it. Anything to add, Jennifer or Brigitte?
No, I think I'm good.
Yes? Okay, so
I'll throw
please,
something
Brigitte.
in there. As you speak about some of the goals that we're hearing from the UN, I think one of the subjects we didn't touch upon today is water. And when I was speaking earlier about how we're diversifying our platform at WSP and combining our services, we really are able to deepen our expertise. And I do think that expertise in water is very important. We have a program, for instance, where we're monitoring extreme rainfall in certain areas. This is something that can be beneficial to every party around this table as we work together to fight, floods and areas of water movement patterns. So again, ideas where we can collaborate together, speak around the table with investors, insurers, and partners to make our world more resilient.
So to close, I would say just from my experience at BNP Paribas that adaptation and resilience have been, first of all, an emerging topic over the last 5-7 years. And while clearly we're still very at the early days to find real solutions, both at the asset, investment, and even business model level, it's definitely a very consensual topic across all our clients, corporate and institutional actors. And it's great these days to have topics that rally everyone. So with that, I'd like to thank you all, Brigitte, Layali, and Jennifer, for joining us on this panel.
Merci.